Okay, so here we are back to talk about the spread of Islam. Uh, and I finished talking about the differences between the Sunni and the Shia branches of Islam, although I should mention there are several different branches. So, under the Umayyad dynasty, the caliphate continues to expands into North Africa and much of Spain until they're checked at the Battle of Tours in France by Charles Martel, also known as Charles the Hammer. At around the same time, there's an attack on Constantinople, the second attack actually, which also resulted in defeat. These two defeats on opposite ends of the Mediterranean sort of heralded the end of the expansionary phase of the Islamic Empire and the beginning of its sort of retrenchment, although certainly not decline. So let's talk a little bit more detail about this. This is some examples of Islamic architecture, and you can see from the examples I've shown you of Byzantine architecture that the architecture is similar. The two cultures are similar. The literature is similar. The role of the leader, being the emperor or the caliph, is similar. You know, there are a lot of similarities. There's a lot of borrowing culturally from each other. In fact, the early caliphs continued to circulate Byzantine coins, just striking out the cross on the back of the coins and replacing it with a staff. So you'd have, you know, what looked like a Byzantine emperor, but instead of holding a cross, he'd be holding a staff in the same style as the Byzantine coins, the same denomination as the Byzantine coins. And it wasn't really until the 8th century that the Arab Caliphate developed its own coinage, different than the Byzantine coinage. So this shows some of the expansion of the Islamic Caliphate. So you can see during Muhammad's life, most of Arabia is brought into the Islamic Caliphate, partially through conquest, partially through alliances, partially through spreading of the faith, through proselytizing, but nonetheless, spread through most of Arabia. This area here were the Ghassanids, who were Byzantine allies, Arabic Bedouin people who were Byzantine allies, and this was an area where the Lakhmids, who were Persian allies, lived. So the first expansion was into Syria and Palestine, and they occupied, this is in sort of 632 to 636, they occupied not Jerusalem itself, but a lot of the inland towns, a lot of the Ghassanid area, and including actually Damascus. At which point they also began to expand into the Persian Empire. There are two major battles at about the same time that signify sort of the ascent of the Islamic Caliphate and the decline, if not end, of Persia and Byzantium. The Battle of Mu'tah in 634 and a second Battle of Mu'tah in 637 both signal the end of the Persian Empire, and it basically collapses by 641, 642. It's essentially gone as a political entity. It collapses very quickly, although some areas that used to be part of Persia up here, and also the area of Tarbistan here, remained independent under Persian rulers who paid, tribute to the Islamic Caliphate. The Battle of Yarmouk was a bit different. The Byzantines were certainly defeated, but it wasn't a rout, and it wasn't the Byzantine army was largely able to retreat intact, but it did signify the end of Byzantine dominance in the Middle East, because after the Battle of after the Battle of Yarmouk, Damascus was reoccupied, Jerusalem fell. About 2 years later, the last Byzantine province, the city of Caesarea, which was a military complex on the coast, fell in 639, and that was the end of Byzantine dominance in Palestine and Syria. Egypt was conquered after being complete by 642. So here's how the Battle of Yarmouk played out. It's a rather interesting story. Heraclius, when he came back from campaign against the Persians, if you read the book, The First Crusader, they talk about sort of this very grueling campaign in the mountains with, this sort of hodgepodge of a Byzantine army with Christian allies, attacking the Persian heartland to convince them to surrender. And Heraclius returns, sort of in glory, in triumph, to Jerusalem to restore the true cross and then on to Constantinople. There's two problems. One, I've already told you the story about when he was entering Jerusalem. He famously fell while trying to enter the city with the true cross, which was seen as an omen of his unworthiness to rule. The other thing that happened is, while on campaign, he married his niece Martina, largely because there was no political reason to do so, and the Byzantines didn't practice the marrying of cousins to keep the bloodline pure or anything like that. So it was largely probably because he was attracted to her that he married her, which was seen as a bit creepy, in Byzantine society, in the same way it would be seen as, a bit creepy in today's society. And this was seen as an incestuous marriage, because she was his niece. And many of their children had birth defects, which is seen as a further omen, and Heraclius began to become ill often, and he seems to have had some sort of cancer that affected his male organs, which was seen as, again, a sign of God having judged against him for his incestuous marriage. So Heraclius, when the Arab, if he died in 630, after defeating the Persians, after entering Jerusalem, he would have been remembered as, probably the greatest of Byzantine emperors. But he didn't. He died in 640. He lived for 10 more years. And 8 of those years saw Islamic expansion into Byzantine territory. So the early expansion went badly. The Byzantines didn't really have an army to fight back. They retreated. They lost Damascus. And in 636, Heraclius sort of bestirs himself and decides to, create a new army to defeat these new invaders once and for all. Being unable to ride a horse due to his cancer, he entrusts the army to his brother, Theodore. So Theodore collects a series of allies, some of whom were Persians who were fleeing from their collapsing state, some of whom seemed to have been Persians that stayed behind after the Persian Empire had left Syria and Palestine and sought Byzantine employ. He also makes alliances with the Jewish tribes, with the Ghassanid tribe, renews that alliance, with Caucasian tribes who were up here, who had been the Byzantine allies against Persia, and has this large Confederate army of a mix of Byzantines and allied, mostly tribal people. And he leads it into Syria. And initially this is frightening enough that the Muslims pull back and wait for the Byzantines to attack, which under Theodore they do. And it's a defeat. It's not quite a rout. The army isn't completely destroyed, but it is a defeat. Upon hearing of the defeat, Heraclius, who was in Antioch, which is a city here, he'd sailed in and was leading a prayer of intercession in the church, basically said, farewell Syria, what a lovely prize you'll make for the enemy. And he arranged for the true cross to be sent from Jerusalem back to Constantinople. He took ship back to Constantinople, and he just sort of left the eastern part of the empire to its fate. What happened to Theodore is a bit interesting. According to the Byzantine sources, he was killed in the battle and, died. And that was the end of him, and with the end of the military leader in the area, the military collapsed. But some of the Arabic sources tell us actually that Theodore converted to Islam either he saw the military power of the Arabs and decided to join the winning side, or the arguments of Islam won him over, and he decided that was the religion for him. Either way, according to several Arabic sources, he converted to Islam and finished out his days as a Muslim. We don't know which is true, but certainly, if I was the Byzantine chroniclers, I wouldn't want to say, "Oh yeah, the emperor's brother converted to the enemy's religion after he was defeated by them and joined them." I would certainly leave that bit out and be like, "Oh yeah, he died," or something. So I find the Muslim story more convincing, but unfortunately there really isn't any proof. So the continued expansion after the Battle of Yarmouk, the Byzantines essentially lost Syria. They lost Egypt, a couple of years later. There was a Byzantine attempt at a counterattack in Egypt, led by Heraclius' son Constans in 646. Don't quote me on the date, though. It could have been 645. But anyway, there's an attempted reconquest of Egypt which fails, which essentially, was the end of Byzantine presence in Egypt. Although they never gave up on it completely, and they actually never gave up on Syria completely either. There were several Byzantine attempts to influence Syria, to reconquer parts of Syria, at several periods where the Byzantines occupied kind of this northern part here, and even once when they almost marched to Jerusalem. So, although this was the end of Byzantine dominance in the Middle East, it was not the end of the Byzantine presence in the Middle East. Keep skipping ahead. From there was expansion into the rest of North Africa. This area here was a Byzantine province called the Exarchate of Carthage, centered around the city of Carthage, now Tunis, in North Africa. The sort of back of this Exarchate, which should really be considered more of a Byzantine vassal state than an integrated part of the empire, was a battle in 654, at which point the military power was destroyed, and most of the fighting was then between the Bedouin tribes of North Africa and the Arab Caliphate, although the Byzantine sort of enclave around Carthage remained until about 700. Once the tribes were defeated and converted, this gave them the new manpower to spread into Spain. And they conquered the Christian kingdoms in Spain with relative ease. One battle was essentially all it took. There was an invasion, at which point the Visigothic king Roderick was defeated. The kingdom sort of broke down into chaos, with some of the rebels siding with the invading Arabs, and all of Spain, up till about the Pyrenees, the Elbe River, was conquered, with sort of a rump state which represented the remaining Visigothic nobility up here. And from there, the Arabs began to raid Gaul, which was then ruled by the Franks. And even some raids are recorded in Italy, which was ruled by the Lombards. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about Islamic literature. The piece of Islamic literature we're probably most familiar with is 1001 Nights, the most popular story of which you probably recognize is Aladdin, which has been made into Disney films and that sort of thing. And it's basically Aladdin shows the survival of the pre-Abrahamic religions in Arabia and Syria and Palestine and Egypt, because Aladdin interacts with a genie, which is a jinn, which is an evil spirit, with the help of a magician. So it shows the survival of the earlier cultures and the early religions, at least to a certain extent. And it shows that this was a blend of cultures, and that the cultural and religious dominance of Islam took time. And that's what most people don't think about when they think about Aladdin and the genie and the magic lamp. So I'm going to stop here and upload this, and we'll continue this lecture in class next week.